The night Harlem fell silent was not because of danger, but because the kind of fear that moves like a shadow had begun to travel between its brick alleys and neon-lit avenues. A fear tied to one name whispered in the darkness: Bumpy Johnson. And on this particular night, a man moved through that silence with the certainty of a ghost, a hitman whose footsteps no one heard, a man whose past had been erased by the choices he made and the choices made for him, a man whose heart had forgotten softness and whose eyes had forgotten mercy, yet something, a tremor, a whisper, a memory shook inside him as he walked toward the barbershop where Bumpy was said to be alone. The hitman, known only as the Whisper, carried not just a blade hidden beneath his coat, but the weight of years spent taking orders he never questioned. And tonight he was told this kill would define his name forever. Yet he couldn't deny that something felt wrong, almost like Harlem itself breathed differently as he passed, as though the windows, the steps, the street lamps all watched him with disapproval, knowing he was about to enter a place where ordinary men did not decide fate. The barbershop glowed dimly with a single golden light that flickered against the glass, and the hitman paused outside, noticing how the warmth inside did not match the cold task he carried. And for a moment he caught his reflection: tired eyes, a tight jaw, a man who had forgotten his own story because he had lived so long inside the stories of others. When he finally pushed the door open, he found Bumpy Johnson sitting in the old leather chair, not startled, not afraid, but calm in a way the hitman had never seen in a man who knew a blade was coming for him. Bumpy looked at him as though he had known him for years, as though he had been expecting him, and with a slow exhale he said, "Son, if you came to end me, you must have lost more than just your path. Maybe you lost yourself." Those words stabbed deeper than any blade ever could, shaking the hitman's resolve, because no target had ever spoken to him like a father, a guide, a man who cared about the soul behind the mission. The hitman stepped closer, but doubts were rising like smoke in his chest, doubts about what he had become, doubts about whether his life meant anything if it could be bought for a name on a page. Bumpy leaned forward, his voice low but steady, telling him that every man reaches a crossroads where he must choose between being a weapon and being a human being, and that tonight wasn't about death, but about whether the hitman was willing to look his own demons in the eye. The hitman felt anger, confusion, shame all battling inside him, because no matter how hard he tried to resist, Bumpy's words were peeling back layers he had buried for decades, layers of a childhood stolen, dreams crushed, innocence traded for survival. He tightened his hand around the handle of the blade hidden in his coat, but his grip trembled, not from fear of Bumpy, but from fear of himself, fear of realizing that maybe he didn't want to kill anymore, maybe he didn't know how to step out of the darkness he had lived in for so long. Bumpy stood up slowly, not to fight, not to defend, but to offer a strange, unexpected grace that shook the hitman to his core, telling him that Harlem didn't need another dead man tonight. It needed a man willing to rise from his ashes and make something of the years he still had. And it was in that moment, one heartbeat suspended in eternity, that the hitman felt something breaking inside him, the armor of silence he had worn his whole life, cracking under the weight of truth. He looked at Bumpy not as a target, but as a mirror reflecting the man he could have been, the man he still might become if he dared to step away from the life that owned him. The barbershop felt smaller now, warmer, almost sacred, as though it had become the birthplace of a decision that would shape not just the night, but the rest of his life. And with breath held tight in his chest, he wondered for the first time whether fate had brought him here to kill Bumpy Johnson, or whether Bumpy Johnson had been placed here to save him from becoming the very thing he feared he already was.
The hitman remained seated in the old barber's chair. Yet he felt as if he were suspended in some strange pocket of time where past, present, and future collided in the silent weight of Bumpy Johnson's gaze. a gaze that seemed to unravel him layer by layer, pulling apart the carefully constructed armor he had worn for years. The armor made of obedience, numbness, and a lifetime of convincing himself that he was nothing more than a tool forged for the convenience of powerful men. The steady hum of Harlem outside drifted through the cracked windows, but inside the barbershop there was a stillness so thick that every breath carried meaning, and the hitman found it nearly impossible to hide behind the coldness he usually wore like a second skin. Bumpy stood with his back partially turned, hands folded loosely behind him, looking at the photographs lining the wall, old snapshots of Harlem's heartbeat, Barbara smiling with customers, little boys posing with fresh cuts, old men laughing at stories of a neighborhood that had once stood on the edge of survival but always fought its way back into light. And as the hitman studied those photos, he felt an unfamiliar ache rise inside him, a longing for belonging, for a sense of place, for a life where he wasn't the shadow people feared, but a man with roots, a man with moments worth framing on a wall. Bumpy finally turned back toward him and spoke in a voice that carried both iron and gentleness, telling him that there comes a point in every man's life where he must confront the truth that terrifies him the most, not the truth about the world, not the truth about others, but the truth about himself, the truth he avoids because admitting it means he must also admit the damage he has done and the damage done to him. The hitman swallowed hard, feeling that truth clawing its way up his throat, because for the first time he was seeing himself not through the distorted lens of the men who owned him, but through the eyes of someone who recognized brokenness and still believed it could be repaired. He tried to speak, to explain how deeply he was entangled in the underworld that had raised him, how men like him didn't get to choose anything except the method of their suffering. But the words came out scattered, tangled in years of silence, and Bumpy listened without judgment, nodding slowly as if he already understood more than the hitman could articulate. Then Bumpy walked to the counter, picked up an old straight razor, not open, not threatening, and placed it on the table between them, a symbolic gesture that made the hitman's heart slam in his chest, because it was the first time in his life someone had willingly placed a blade within reach without fear, as if Bumpy knew he would not use it, as if he trusted the part of the hitman did not even trust himself. That simple act cracked something inside him, something brittle and suffocated, something that remembered what it felt like to be seen as human rather than a weapon dressed in skin. Bumpy leaned on the counter and said that men who live by violence eventually learn that violence is the weakest form of strength, because anyone can destroy, but only the truly brave can build, protect, and preserve, and those who choose creation over destruction are the ones history remembers with respect rather than fear. The hitman's breath shook as he listened, because all his life he had mistaken fear for respect, survival for purpose, silence for strength. And now, sitting here, he felt those illusions collapsing one by one like fragile glass. He confessed with a trembling voice that he didn't know if he deserved redemption, didn't know if there was anything left inside him worth salvaging after years of staining his hands with the decisions of other men. And Bumpy stepped closer, placing a hand on the back of the barber's chair and saying that redemption was never about deserving, it was about choosing. That sentence hit the hitman like a tidal wave, because it contradicted every belief he had built his life on, every lie he had allowed himself to live in, and it opened a door in his mind he had kept sealed for decades. He stared at the floor, at the cracks in the old wooden boards, and wondered how many men had sat here before him at their own crossroads, how many had walked out changed because someone finally spoke the truth they needed to hear. The weight of his mission pressed against him again, the order he had been given, the threat that came with refusing it, the danger waiting for him the moment he decided to walk away. And he told Bumpy everything, speaking in long, tangled breaths about the men who controlled him, men who erased anyone who failed them, men who treated human lives like numbers on paper. Bumpy's expression grew darker, not out of fear, but out of disappointment in the cruelty of a world that exploited broken boys and turned them into soulless weapons. And he told the hitman that the hardest chains to break are not the ones forged by others, but the ones we tighten around our own wrists when we convince ourselves we are trapped. The hitman felt those chains now, heavy and cold, yet strangely loosening with every word spoken in this room. He asked Bumpy how a man could walk away from a life that had defined him for so long, how he could break free when the only thing he had ever been taught was loyalty to the wrong people. And Bumpy answered that loyalty meant nothing when it demanded a man destroy his own soul. That truth struck with such force that the hitman felt his chest tighten because he realized that he had never been loyal out of belief. He had been loyal out of fear, out of the desperate need to belong somewhere, even if that place was built on darkness. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the memories wash through him. Alleys where he learned to run, rooftops where he learned to hide, eyes he had looked into before ending a life, and the silence that haunted him every night afterward. He wondered if all those years of violence was simply him trying to convince the world he was strong, when deep down he had always been running from something inside himself, the small, frightened boy who had once prayed for a chance to be more than a shadow. When he opened his eyes again, Bumpy was watching him with a patience he had never found in anyone, and that patience alone made the hitman feel something he had not felt in years, the possibility of change. Bumpy told the hitman that a man is not defined by the path he walked into the storm, but the path he chooses when he realizes he no longer wants to live inside thunder, and that every road out of darkness begins with a single step, a step he felt the hitman was ready to take, even if he didn't believe it himself. The hitman's throat tightened again because he knew that stepping away meant facing men who hunted their own without hesitation, men who would not see his transformation as courage, but as betrayal. But Bumpy dismissed the fear with a calm certainty, saying that fear loses its power the moment a man decides his life is worth more than the chains he was given, and that the world breaks men until they learn how to rebuild themselves stronger. The hitman's eyes burned as he listened to the door, at Bumpy, at the room that had somehow become a sanctuary he didn't know he needed, and he felt a shift inside him, a soft but undeniable shift that told him he was no longer the same man who had walked into this shop with murder in his heart. Something fragile had awakened within him, something dangerously close to hope, something like the faint beginning of a new story waiting for him beyond this night. And as the barbershop light flickered once more, painting both men in shadows and gold, the hitman realized that this was no ordinary meeting. This was the crossroads of his life, the turning point he had always needed but never expected to find. And the man he had been sent to kill was becoming the very man who might finally teach him how to live.
The hitman rose slowly from the barber's chair, not because Bumpy demanded it, but because something inside him, a quiet, trembling, awakening force, urged him to stand like a man facing the truth rather than a weapon waiting for its next command. And as his legs straightened, he felt the strange sensation of the old life loosening its grip while the unknown future pressed against him with a weight he had never carried before. The barbershop walls, lined with photographs of men who had laughed, cried, argued, and rebuilt themselves inside this same room, seemed to lean inward, as if witnessing the birth of a decision that would alter not just the hitman's fate, but the rhythm of Harlem itself. Because men like him were not meant to pause, to reflect, or to question. They were meant to follow orders until the day their own names appeared on a list like the ones they had memorized for years. Yet tonight something had shifted so profoundly inside him that even the air felt different, charged with a softness he didn't recognize and a heaviness he couldn't deny. And Bumpy watched him with the quiet intensity of a man who understood the fragility of this moment, who knew that the hitman was walking a thin line between the shadows that owned him and the light that terrified him. Bumpy stepped closer, his voice lower now, almost fatherly, explaining that a man can run from many things, danger, death, enemies, but the one thing he cannot outrun is himself, and sooner or later every man must confront the mirror he has spent years avoiding. And those words dug deep into the hitman's chest because he knew exactly what that mirror held. Regrets he had buried so thoroughly he believed they'd died, faces of people he had erased at the command of others, and the ghost of the boy he used to be, watching him silently, waiting for him to finally ask whether becoming a killer had ever been his choice or simply the consequence of a world that had offered him nothing but darkness. He turned away from Bumpy, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding himself against the tidal wave of emotions tearing through him, and he whispered a confession he had never spoken aloud, not to his employers, not to the streets, not even to himself, that every time he ended a life, a part of him disappeared too, a part he could never get back, and now he feared there wasn't enough left inside him to rebuild anything real. Bumpy listened with an unwavering composure, letting the hitman spill emotions that had been locked away for decades, and then he responded with a calm, firm conviction, saying that the world doesn't break men because they are weak, it breaks them because they are strong enough to endure the cracking long enough to rise again. And if the hitman had survived the years he had lived, then he had more strength in him than he ever allowed himself to believe. The hitman felt his breath tighten as he absorbed those words, because deep down he had always believed strength was measured by the number of men you could intimidate, the number of enemies you could silence. But now he was seeing that true strength was the ability to face the weight of your own scars without letting them define the rest of your life. He turned away from Bumpy, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding himself against the tidal wave of emotions tearing through him, and he whispered a confession he had never spoken aloud, not to his employers, not to the streets, not even to himself, that every time he ended a life, a part of him disappeared too, a part he could never get back, and now he feared there wasn't enough left inside him to rebuild anything real. Bumpy listened with an unwavering composure, letting the hitman spill emotions that had been locked away for decades, and then he responded with a calm, firm conviction, saying that the world doesn't break men because they are weak, it breaks them because they are strong enough to endure the cracking long enough to rise again. And if the hitman had survived the years he had lived, then he had more strength in him than he ever allowed himself to believe. The hitman felt his breath tighten as he absorbed those words, because deep down he had always believed strength was measured by the number of men you could intimidate, the number of enemies you could silence. But now he was seeing that true strength was the ability to face the weight of your own scars without letting them define the rest of your life. He turned away from Bumpy, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding himself against the tidal wave of emotions tearing through him, and he whispered a confession he had never spoken aloud, not to his employers, not to the streets, not even to himself, that every time he ended a life, a part of him disappeared too, a part he could never get back, and now he feared there wasn't enough left inside him to rebuild anything real. Bumpy listened with an unwavering composure, letting the hitman spill emotions that had been locked away for decades, and then he responded with a calm, firm conviction, saying that the world doesn't break men because they are weak, it breaks them because they are strong enough to endure the cracking long enough to rise again. And if the hitman had survived the years he had lived, then he had more strength in him than he ever allowed himself to believe. The hitman felt his breath tighten as he absorbed those words, because deep down he had always believed strength was measured by the number of men you could intimidate, the number of enemies you could silence. But now he was seeing that true strength was the ability to face the weight of your own scars without letting them define the rest of your life. He turned away from Bumpy, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding himself against the tidal wave of emotions tearing through him, and he whispered a confession he had never spoken aloud, not to his employers, not to the streets, not even to himself, that every time he ended a life, a part of him disappeared too, a part he could never get back, and now he feared there wasn't enough left inside him to rebuild anything real.
Bumpy listened with an unwavering composure, letting the hitman spill emotions that had been locked away for decades, and then he responded with a calm, firm conviction, saying that the world doesn't break men because they are weak, it breaks them because they are strong enough to endure the cracking long enough to rise again. And if the hitman had survived the years he had lived, then he had more strength in him than he ever allowed himself to believe. The hitman felt his breath tighten as he absorbed those words, because deep down he had always believed strength was measured by the number of men you could intimidate, the number of enemies you could silence. But now he was seeing that true strength was the ability to face the weight of your own scars without letting them define the rest of your life. He turned away from Bumpy, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding himself against the tidal wave of emotions tearing through him, and he whispered a confession he had never spoken aloud, not to his employers, not to the streets, not even to himself, that every time he ended a life, a part of him disappeared too, a part he could never get back, and now he feared there wasn't enough left inside him to rebuild anything real. Bumpy listened with an unwavering composure, letting the hitman spill emotions that had been locked away for decades, and then he responded with a calm, firm conviction, saying that the world doesn't break men because they are weak, it breaks them because they are strong enough to endure the cracking long enough to rise again. And if the hitman had survived the years he had lived, then he had more strength in him than he ever allowed himself to believe. The hitman felt his breath tighten as he absorbed those words, because deep down he had always believed strength was measured by the number of men you could intimidate, the number of enemies you could silence. But now he was seeing that true strength was the ability to face the weight of your own scars without letting them define the rest of your life. He turned away from Bumpy, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding himself against the tidal wave of emotions tearing through him, and he whispered a confession he had never spoken aloud, not to his employers, not to the streets, not even to himself, that every time he ended a life, a part of him disappeared too, a part he could never get back, and now he feared there wasn't enough left inside him to rebuild anything real. Bumpy listened with an unwavering composure, letting the hitman spill emotions that had been locked away for decades, and then he responded with a calm, firm conviction, saying that the world doesn't break men because they are weak, it breaks them because they are strong enough to endure the cracking long enough to rise again. And if the hitman had survived the years he had lived, then he had more strength in him than he ever allowed himself to believe. The hitman felt his breath tighten as he absorbed those words, because deep down he had always believed strength was measured by the number of men you could intimidate, the number of enemies you could silence. But now he was seeing that true strength was the ability to face the weight of your own scars without letting them define the rest of your life. He turned away from Bumpy, gripping the edge of the counter as if grounding himself against the tidal wave of emotions tearing through him, and he whispered a confession he had never spoken aloud, not to his employers, not to the streets, not even to himself, that every time he ended a life, a part of him disappeared too, a part he could never get back, and now he feared there wasn't enough left inside him to rebuild anything real. Bumpy listened with an unwavering composure, letting the hitman spill emotions that had been locked away for decades, and then he responded with a calm, firm conviction, saying that the world doesn't break men because they are weak, it breaks them because they are strong enough to endure the cracking long enough to rise again. And if the hitman stood in the center of the barbershop as though he were standing between two worlds, one behind him, built from years of cold orders and darker loyalties, and another ahead of him, a world he did not understand but could feel calling to him with a force strong enough to make his chest tighten. And as the weight of that choice settled upon him, he realized that the night had changed him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. Bumpy watched him like a man witnessing a seed finally break through soil after years of darkness, and he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a tone meant only for a soul standing at its own doorway, telling him that every transformation begins with a single terrifying decision, and that the most dangerous moment in a man's life is not when he is hunted by his enemies, but when he is finally brave enough to confront the life he has lived without flinching away. The hitman felt those words stirring something raw inside him, something that made his heart beat louder than the distant hum of Harlem outside, louder than the ticking of the old clock on the wall, louder even than his own fear. It was the beating of a heart that wanted to live rather than merely survive. And in that moment he admitted, in a voice filled with equal parts shame and desperation, that he didn't know how to be anything other than what the streets had carved him into. He didn't know how to walk through the world as a man who believed in tomorrow, because tomorrow had always been a luxury he never thought he'd earn. Bumpy nodded, placing a steady hand on his shoulder, telling him that no man is born knowing how to start over. Every man learns it in the same way, by taking one step he fears and then another, until the fear becomes memory and the memory becomes strength. Those words wrapped around the hitman like armor made not from steel, but from truth, and he exhaled a breath that carried years of buried pain and unsaid confessions. He looked down at the blade he had set aside earlier, seeing it now not as a weapon, but as a symbol of everything he was choosing to leave behind, and he pushed it even farther away on the table, as though distancing himself from the version of himself he no longer wished to inhabit. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a soft tremor across the street, and the flickering streetlight cast moving shadows across the barbershop floor, shadows that looked almost like the ghosts of his past, trying to pull him back into the darkness. Yet for the first time, he didn't feel powerless in front of them. Instead, he straightened his back, lifted his chin slightly, and asked Bumpy the question that had been burning in his chest since the moment he chose not to kill him. What happens when they come for me? And Bumpy, with the calm certainty of a man who had lived through wars both inside and outside himself, answered that the men who fear his transformation will try to drag him back into the shadows, but their power ends the moment he refuses to bow to them, because a man who has chosen his own identity is far more dangerous than a man who follows orders without thought. The hitman felt a strange surge of strength rise in him, not the strength of fists or weapons, but the strength of a man who has finally seen himself clearly and refuses to turn away. He walked toward the shop door, placing his hand on the metal handle, and stared out at the Harlem night, the same streets that had once shaped him into a ghost, now calling him to step into them as a human being reclaiming his own story. The fear was still there, cold and sharp, but it no longer controlled him. Instead, it sharpened him in a new way, reminding him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to move despite it. He turned to Bumpy one last time, and the older man met his gaze with a mixture of respect and quiet pride, telling him that the world may not forgive him easily, but forgiveness is not something he needed from the world. It is something he must learn to give himself, slowly, patiently, one day at a time. The hitman felt a heaviness lift from his chest as those words sank in, and he nodded silently, understanding that redemption was not a destination, but a long road he was now choosing to walk. He pushed open the door, letting the cold night air rush in, carrying with it the smell of Harlem's heartbeat, street food, jazz, old brick, life, and he stepped outside not as the man who had entered with murder in his heart, but as someone reborn in a single night of truth. Behind him, Bumpy watched through the window as the hitman disappeared into the shadows, not as prey or predator, but as a man stepping into his own reflection for the first time. And as the door closed softly, the barbershop returned to its quiet hum, yet something in the air felt changed, as though the room itself had witnessed a miracle, the moment a man who had been shaped by violence chose, at last, to rise from it. The hitman walked with steady steps, knowing the danger waiting ahead, yet refusing to let fear dictate his story anymore. He understood now that even if the world hunted him tomorrow, tonight he had claimed something priceless, the right to choose who he would become. And in that quiet, powerful realization, Harlem gained not another ghost, but a man determined to build a life worth fighting for. One step, one breath, one redeemed moment.